today, this guest could sing for us, she could act for us, she could interpret law for us. She could sit in the corner and giggle in a little southern Indiana way, which sometimes got her in trouble back in the day. But today we're here to celebrate her as an author of 2 best-selling novels, Mill River Recluse,
Either way,
whichever you want it.
Tomato,
tomato, and as well as Mill River Redemption. We're very pleased to welcome our guest, author Darci Chan. Welcome back to Paoli. We're so glad to have you here. We're also very pleased to welcome Miles Flynn, who will be interviewing Darci. And thank you all for being here. Welcome, Darci.
Thank you, Larry.
To see such a great crowd here today, and it's nice to finally meet you in person. I know we've corresponded, but it's good to meet you face to face. And to start off with, I guess I'd like to record this so that I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone and write a story next week. Begin by, you could just tell me about what it was like growing up here.
Oh, wow. Well, I just first like to say thank you to the library for hosting me today, and especially to Larry for that nice introduction, and to Cynthia Webb, who coordinated pretty much this whole event. I really appreciate that very much. I lived in Paoli for 4 years when I was in high school, from 9th through 12th grade. And my mom is a teacher, as most of you know, or was a teacher until she retired. And my dad lives in southern Indiana also. He was the executive director of Silvercrest Children's Development Center for many years before he retired. So Paoli for me was the largest school I think that I had attended growing up. And for me that presented a whole world of opportunity that I hadn't experienced yet, because they had so many classes, and they had the school newspaper, which I sought out immediately and learned that, as a freshman, I really couldn't write for the Paoli. I had to wait until I was a junior. Mrs. Yu told me that. I was kind of upset over that. But I love to write as long as I can remember. Mom and Dad, being both in education, taught me how to read and write very early. And I will share with you my earliest writing memory was my first day of preschool, and Mom had dropped me off in the little preschool in a church basement, and being the oldest child and with a stay-at-home mom at the time, I had a bit of separation anxiety, so I screamed and cried and threw a huge fit and got sick, and then spent the rest of the morning writing notes to her on the chalkboard. Mom, please come back. Mom, I miss you. Mom, I love you. So I distinctly remember that. And then the writing just sort of stayed with me as I grew up. When I was about 11, I was living in Colorado at the time, and I entered a school writing contest. And I won the short story competition, and I came home with a little trophy, and I think that's the first time I articulated the desire to be a writer when I got older. And, my parents were, supportive of that. Mom was like, great, go for it. And Dad says, well, that's it's a tough thing to do, and you can always write, but it's hard to be a writer. It's very tough to sort of break out, and, it's something that you can always do, but maybe you should also think about doing something else to be able to always take care of yourself and keep the writing dream and do that on the side. And so I actually ended up following both of their advice at various times. And I'm very glad that I did, because it is tough to make it as a writer. And it's you have to have a thick skin. You encounter rejection. You encounter people who are very mean-spirited in their review of your work. It's a long road to hoe. And so I always kept the dream alive of being able to write books, but when I was in college, I became very interested in environmental law, and I decided that I would go to law school and pursue a career in that field, because number one, I really was interested in it. I saw the movie The Pelican Brief, and that sort of sparked it for me, and then I started reading about it. And it was sort of at the dawn of where all these environmental statutes were being enacted, and I thought, wow, that would be a great thing to be involved in. So I ended up going to law school, and then I took a job with the U.S. Senate, where I was responsible for drafting environmental and natural resource legislation. And I did that for 14 years. I loved it. I loved the people in my office. It was a nonpartisan job, so I got to see all of the inner workings of how the legislature works and work on bills from the beginning introductory stages until it was enacted as a law and signed by the president. And I intended to do that for the rest of my working career. I intended to retire, after serving in this office. And certainly that was the typical course. My supervisor at the time is now getting ready to take over as head of the office, and he has been there more than 30 years. So in 2011, well, actually back in 2000, I decided to attempt to write a first novel. I had, done my law school education, and I was settled into my job. I didn't have my son yet. I had a lot of time because my husband was in his residency, and he was gone in the evenings and overnight, and I had a lot of free time after work. So I thought, now is the time that I'm going to try to write a book for the first time. And I just got done working on a piece of the Farm Bill, which, it's a really important piece of legislation that provides for all the agricultural programs in the country. And my piece of it was 400 pages long. And after I did that, I thought, well, goodness, if I can handle 400 pages of legalese, then surely, and I had to turn that around in like a week's time to edit it and get it, formatted. So if I could do that, then I can spend my free time writing a book that I would, something creative that I would really, really get into. So I started writing in the evenings. It took about 2.5 years to finish a first draft of what eventually became the Mill River Recluse. And at that time, ebooks were, they hadn't come into play yet. Nobody knew what an ebook was. Kindle didn't exist. The only way you could get a book published was to find a literary agent to represent your work, and then he or she would submit it to the big publishers in New York and try to sell the book on your behalf. So that's what I researched how to do this and started down the road. Took about a year to edit the manuscript and find an agent. I had over 200 rejections from agents that I would contact and send pieces of the manuscript or the whole thing. And that's normal, especially if you are a completely unknown person who's never published anything, which I was. So I finally found a really good agent who was willing to take a chance on me. But she said up front, she said, Darci, this is going to be a tough sell. Nobody knows you. This book really doesn't fall into any kind of genre. It's not a mystery. It's not a romance. It's not a thriller. It's not a horror. It has elements of a lot of those things, but it really is not the kind of book that a publisher could say, oh, I know how we can describe this so that we can sell it. But she said, I love the story, and I'm willing to take a chance, just so long as you know that it's going to be a tough sell. So I said, well, that's all I can ask for. And I was thrilled that she saw something in it that made her want to take that chance. So she worked for 2 years to try to place it for me and could not. She went to every publisher, mid-sized, big publishers, independent publishers. And, it was tough for her too, because she really believed in the story. So finally we just decided to hang it up, and I put the book in the drawer. She says, write another one and we'll try again. She said, once I get on the road with somebody, she's like, I'm not the kind of agent who is with you for one book, and if it doesn't sell, you're gone. She said, I believe in your writing, and I'm on the road with you now. So I thought, great. So I decided to try to write another one at some point, but my job got very busy. My husband finished school, and we ended up moving to New York so that he could take a new job. And then we had our son. So in like 3 years, I had very little sleep, and I like to tell people that I'm still catching up on that sleep. But in that 3 years, ebooks really took off. And I started reading stories about how writers who put books out there for people to read were getting a lot of great feedback, sometimes even building a following of people who read books on these Kindles or Nooks or whatever they had. So I called my agent and I said, well, what would you think of me uploading this? We've shopped it everywhere. You know, I didn't have anything to lose at that point. But I thought, well, maybe if I got some objective feedback from people who really don't know me, I could use that to write a better second book. And she says, go for it. You know, there's no harm in that. So in May 2011, I uploaded the manuscript as an ebook. And I did a cover based on the old house on the hill. I guess it's the Dillman house now, but the Cornwall Mansion is what a lot of people call it. And just crossed my fingers, and you know, I hoped something would happen, although I didn't expect to sell many copies at all. I thought maybe over the course of years, a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 eventually. So the first month that it was on sale, we sold 100 copies. And I was so excited. I thought that was huge. 100 people had my book. And, you know, my husband was just, you know, beside himself, and our son was a toddler, and we were like, look, 100 people bought Mommy's book. And of course, Gavin was like, ah, you know, he didn't understand anything. And then I realized that really there were a lot of self-published books out there. Nobody was going to find mine unless I did something to distinguish it from the other ones that were out there. So I arranged for some features on websites that feature ebooks to people who read them. And I did a few do-it-yourself online internet ads using Photoshop as best I could. It was not a lot. I set up a website, I set up a Facebook page, and a Twitter account, which are these social media things that are huge now. And the first feature of my book hit with one of these websites that, you know, people can subscribe to learn about bargain ebooks or new ebooks that have been released. And within 2 days, I sold another 600 copies. I thought, whoa, that was fast.
Yeah.
And at that point, my husband says, well, maybe you really could sell 1,000. And I said, you never know. And so a couple more of these features happened. And the strange thing was, each time something happened, you know, the sales would spike. They would go up higher. But they wouldn't fall back down, and it kept going up and up and up and up. In July 2011, which is about 2 months after I'd uploaded it, I'd sold 14,000 copies, and I called my agent and I said, something is happening. And I just said, you should know about it because, you know, I'm not doing anything. All the features that I'd arranged had run. But the numbers were still climbing every day. And I was noticing, you know, people were talking about it online. You could Google the title of the book and you'd see mentions on blogs and community discussion boards, which is a good thing. It's a very good thing. So Lori said, all right, let's just keep an eye on it. She said, if the sales continue to climb, we may be able to go back out on submission with it. She said, because it's been years since it was out there. All the editors and the staff at the publishing houses have changed. You know, this would be like a fresh book, especially if it were backed with sales data that show that people really liked it. So I said, all right. She said, but you should know that to get any sort of attention from a big publisher, you probably would have to sell about 50,000 copies fast, like in a month. And, you know, I said, well, you know, I will try. I don't know what's going to happen at this point, but I will keep you posted. So the sales continued to go up, and we were at 50,000 by the end of July. And then by mid-August, we hit 100,000 sales. And she called me. My dad was out visiting me when this happened. She called, and she left a message on my answering machine. She's like, Darce, check your email. I was like, what is this supposed to mean? So she had sent me the advance copy of the New York Times bestseller list, and my book was number 12 on the ebook list for the week of August 17th or something like that. So at that point, you know, once a book gets on the New York Times list, it starts a cycle of publicity where, you know, many newspapers in the country run that list. They pick it up, they publicize it further, blogs pick it up. So things just continue to sort of snowball after that. And by December or so, the Wall Street Journal had contacted me and wanted to do a feature story on my whole experience. And this, you know, it's like every time I thought, okay, this is at the peak, this is where it's going to stop and things are going to go back to normal. No, something else would happen. And so the day after Thanksgiving in 2011, I met with a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. She came to my house, and she was very sweet. Her name was Alexandra Alter, and she was their one of their main book publishing reporters, and she's since moved to the New York Times. So I was prepared for this. I wasn't really nervous at all. We sat down on the couch, and she said, "Oh, it's so nice to be back in New York." She said, "Last week I was up in Maine interviewing Stephen King," and I was like, "What do you say?" I mean, at that point I started to realize, oh my gosh, this is going to change things. And so we did the interview. It was scheduled to run in the Friday magazine December 9th. And it came out, and pandemonium ensued. So my phone started ringing off the hook. I very quickly had to unlist my number. I had clients at work who didn't know anything about my little writing hobby emailing me and saying, "Oh my God, is this you?" You know, people, they publicize it further, blogs pick it up. So things just continued to sort of snowball after that. And by December or so, the Wall Street Journal had contacted me and wanted to do a feature story on my whole experience. And this, it's like every time I thought, okay, this is at the peak, this is where it's going to stop and things are going to go back to normal. No, something else would happen. And so the day after Thanksgiving in 2011, I met with a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. She came to my house, and she was very sweet. Her name was Alexandra Alter, and she was their one of their main book publishing reporters, and she's since moved to the New York Times. So I was prepared for this. I wasn't really nervous at all. We sat down on the couch, and she said, "Oh, it's so nice to be back in New York." She said, "Last week I was up in Maine interviewing Stephen King," and I was like, "What do you say?" I mean, at that point I started to realize, oh my gosh, this is going to change things. And so we did the interview. It was scheduled to run in the Friday magazine December 9th. And it came out, and pandemonium ensued. So my phone started ringing off the hook. I very quickly had to unlist my number. I had clients at work who didn't know anything about my little writing hobby emailing me and saying, "Oh my God, is this you?" People in my office were just sort of dumbfounded, and it was just crazy. And then that Friday, so it was a Friday morning when the paper came out, and just when I was sort of starting to calm down and function, I get an email from a photo editor at Yahoo News. He said, we're going to pick up the Wall Street story, but they're not releasing your photo to us. Do you have a photo that you can send us? So that, again, by the end of the day, the story was on the front page of Yahoo News. And so I had to become kind of a hermit for a little while. I became the Recluse for a little while. Just kind of hid in my house. So that whole escalation really changed things, and by Christmas, Random House had offered me the chance to write 2 new books, both set in the same fictional village of Mill River, Vermont. And I really wanted to do this, but as a Senate employee, it was a very tough decision. If you work for the federal government and you write as a hobby, if you self-publish ebooks, there's no problem with that. But if you start to write as a career, as your sort of main source of income and your vocation, then it becomes difficult, because there are lots of federal regulations out there that prohibit outside employment, or that require you to get permission to do various things in pursuit of an outside type activity. So for 3 months, I worked with the head of my office and the people who supervised our office to try to figure out a way that I could do both. And it became very clear that even if I could manage to write a book by the contract deadline that they proposed, I was still going to have to get permission from my boss to accept every contract that was offered, including all the foreign rights contracts, to do interviews. I would have to structure any sort of promotional activities when the Senate was out of session. And it wasn't just his permission, but it was the President Pro Tem of the Senate and sort of the Ethics Committee, which they had to approve every contract. And they were willing to do that. But, if you're going to try to make it as a writer, if you're going to try to write books full-time, which is a very difficult thing, you really have to put everything you have into it. Your time, your effort, your thoughts, and it just became really clear that I wasn't going to be able to do both. And so then I had to choose. And, I remember calling my dad the night I decided to resign and pursue to accept the offer. And I said, well, would you do this if you were me? He says, yeah, I would make that decision. He says, you have a law degree, you can take care of yourself. You can always go back that if you have to. And I think that's true. So I went for it, and I did it instantly. And so I resigned the next day. It was a really tough decision, and I really expected to be working with these people for the rest of my career. I'm still close with a lot of them. But I think it was the right one. It was 3 years ago now. And that's sort of how I came to be in the position that I'm in.
Well, it sounds like a real whirlwind once you put it out there. You probably didn't have a lot of time to reflect on it, I imagine, but did you ever think, what if I had just put this in the drawer and moved on?
I did. I like to think that someday I would have gotten a book published. That was my goal when I started writing. Sometime in my life, I want to get a book published. And if it didn't happen with the first one, I thought, well, most first novels don't sell. They just don't. And if they do sell, they don't do very well because it's very tough to market them. It's tough to convince people to take a chance on a new writer that they don't know. They'd much rather buy a book by someone they've read stories of before. And so, but I like to think that I would have tried again and, had Lori shop it around or whatever. And eventually, I like to think I would have broken through, but I don't know. I mean, it's just one of these things that I had no idea what I was getting myself into at all. Not at all.
Wow. Sounds like quite an experience then. And I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about, you said you were working your day job, you say, which involved a lot of, I would say, very dry writing at times.
Yeah.
Did you feel like going home and writing more after that?
Yes, because I needed a creative outlet.
Okay, I see.
I will tell you that there are a lot of things about drafting legislation that do require creativity. Like when someone comes to you with a change in policy or how the law is, and you need to take that idea and look at how the law reads currently and figure out how to work it in. What changes you have to make, how do you do it in a way that's consistent so you don't invite a lawsuit from someone who feels like the law doesn't apply appropriately or apply to them. So it's almost like putting a puzzle together in a way, and so that does require creativity. And the other thing that I found, and it goes back to handling long documents, when you write a piece of legislation, you want to express the same idea the same way every time. Otherwise, a court will look at a difference in language and say, well, Congress must have meant to say these things differently. They must mean two different things. Now, of course, when you write a book, the last thing you want to do is say the same thing more than once, and you sure don't want to say it the same way both times if you have it in the book. But being able to keep a document in mind and work through it and know when things happen and where things are in the particular piece, I found was very helpful when I'm working with a manuscript because I can keep track in my mind of what character did what at what time and the pacing and when things need to happen in order to have the story fall into place. So.
Okay. And did you find that you had thought about pieces of this story or characters of this story for a long time before you really sat down to try to put this together?
I did. I took it. A lot of writers take they have idea lists of things that they want to write books about, and they're constantly jotting things down. And so they may have 20 book ideas stored up, And I'm not like that at all. It takes me a long time to decide on a story, to come up with the pieces, to come up with the characters. And when I was first thinking about the concept of the story in the Mill River Recluse, the first image that came to mind was that big white house in Paoli. Because I grew up looking at that house. You know, even when we didn't live here, we'd drive to town and visit Helen Richardson, who was my maternal grandmother. She lived here for years and years. And you know, in the back seat of the car, after being in the car for 8 hours or 2 days or however long it was for us to get here, we'd come around the square and we'd see that big white house, and we'd go up and then we'd come out, you know, on 150 to go to her place. So it was sort of ingrained in my mind, and I'd always wondered, what's in that house? And it's sort of a mysterious and gorgeous thing to have. And I said, you know, I'd really love to incorporate a big white mansion like that in a story. And of course, then I heard about Saul Strauss. Ruth Wasudi was a very good friend of mine, and she told me about him and what he did for Paoli. I don't know I assume most people here have heard of him, but he was a Jewish gentleman who moved here in the 1940s and fled Nazi Germany with his mother. And he opened a dry goods store on the square, and he lived there and did business here for the rest of his life. From what I was able to learn, he was accepted by the community, but not fully embraced just because he was Jewish, and this was the 1940s, and you know, it was sort of a difficult thing for someone to come here who had a different faith than most other people. But when he passed away, he left a lot of his income and assets to the town for the benefit of the people, because he was so thankful to have a community like Paoli to call his home after coming from, you know, a horrible place in Nazi Germany. And that Saul Strauss Fund is still in operation today, and it provides grants to the high school for books, and it provides help for needy kids and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, among other things. And people in the community can also apply for a grant from the Saul Strauss Fund to do a project for the benefit of the town. So I was so moved by that. I thought that is just such an amazing thing to hear how someone who was sort of an outsider in a way, who would still have such love for the people that he lived with, and wanted to do something like that to help them, not only for the rest of their lives, but for the rest of their children's lives and their children's lives. So I decided to try to craft a story around someone who was unknown and mysterious to her community, who lived in a big white house on a hill overlooking her town, and who yet decided to do something wonderful for all of these people. And that was the main concept of the story.
Are there any other aspects of Paoli, or maybe some people who pop up in there from time to time?
Well, there's a character named Daisy Delane, which, you know, she's a little kooky, and she's patterned after someone. I won't name him. I think a lot of people, I think the man is passed on, but I think a lot of people might know who he was. I will say that in the new book, The Mill River Redemption, there's a character named Ivy Collard, and many of her characteristics are patterned after Nanny, my maternal grandmother. She was very loving, and she had sort of a kind of a bawdy streak, and you know, just kind of loved everybody. And I put those things into Ivy, thinking of her. And the other thing that Ivy does, she always calls Josie kid, and Mrs. Yu did that. Mm-hmm. You know, kid. It doesn't matter if you're 40 years old, you're still her kid. You know, she said, kid, you better not do that. Kid, you better, you know. So that's, I took aspects of people that I know and put them into the characters.
Okay. And at what point did you start thinking about Mill River Redemption? Did you start to see some of that coming out while you were still working on your original book?
I actually, well, after the original book came out and sort of exploded, I was kind of shell-shocked for a while. And then when I knew I was going to get the opportunity to write another 2 books, actually, in the same fictional town, I started kind of putting together a new idea. And the whole concept of a story that revolves around sisters. I have 2 younger sisters. Most of you probably know them or knew them. And we're all very close. And the idea of that sort of closeness and exploring that was very appealing to me. And I thought to myself, well, it would be very challenging to write a story about two sisters who were once that close and who experienced something that causes them to become estranged. And I really wanted to explore how much that sisterly bond can take. Is it really something that can be broken? Is it something that, despite something horrific happening, will still remain and can be repaired? And so that's sort of the central idea with the Mill River Redemption. And I also wanted to work in some of the characters and storylines from the first book because, I've found that my books, because they take place in a small town and because I grew up in small towns my whole life, the town itself is almost a character. It's almost a place that you want to move to, that I would want to move to. It's warm and inviting and cozy. And yet, like all small towns, there are problems. There are people who want to know everything about what's going on in town and who mean well but don't actually do things that benefit those that they're trying to benefit. But I wanted to keep that feeling from the first book to the second, and hopefully now for the third, which is in first draft form. I just wanted to keep the town intact and have that continued as well.
Okay. I was going to ask you about number 3, and it sounds like it's already well underway.
It is. My editor has it now. She should start reading it soon, so I'm sort of waiting to hear what she thinks. I don't have a title yet. I have a title that I want, but it hasn't been approved yet, so I don't know if that's what it'll be. But it also takes place in Mill River. It has a lot of the characters of the first 2, and I will give you a little tidbit and tell you that it focuses on Father O'Brien and his backstory. So it alternates between the Great Depression, when he was a young boy, and present.
Something everybody's looking forward to, I imagine. Okay. I wanted to find out a little bit about your writing process then, when you were obviously juggling a lot of things,
Right.
with your writing process now that you are exclusively a writer.
Yeah.
So could you sort of contrast those for us?
Sure. The first book, of course, I just wrote in my own time, at my own pace, after hours. And there were some days that I didn't work on it at all. There were some days that I wrote 10 pages and felt sort of brain dead afterwards. With the second one and the third one, I look at it very much as my job now. And I have time during the day. My son is in preschool, and we have a babysitter who helps us out, when I need a little extra time. So I kind of treat it like a job. I get up, I get into school, sort of get myself going, make some coffee, and then I'm working on the book. When I'm actively writing or when I'm actively researching, I am working on the book during that time. And having a deadline is helpful, I found. I wrote it much faster. The first book, I said, took 2.5 years. The writing of Redemption, the actual writing, took about 6 months. So that's much faster. And it just flowed out. I was so shocked. The story just came out. It was the most amazing feeling just to see the words pouring onto the page. And I thought, wow, it's going to be great. This is how it's going to be from now on. The third book, it was like I had to struggle to get everything. I don't know why. I don't know why that is. I had the story. It took me a while to work out the story and the kinks in it and the pacing, but it didn't flow like the second one. And yet, my agent reads everything before I give it to my editor, and I said, I really don't think that the third one fits. It didn't feel like it fit with the first and the second. She's like, oh, it fits, and she said it's better than your second one. I was like, well, okay, I'm glad you think that. And of course, it'll go through editing, and the book changes enormously from the first time you get it on the page until, the final product. And so I think that I do like the story. I do like Father O'Brien as a character a great deal, and I wanted people to know why he has his issue with spoons. And if those of you who have read the book, so you'll read that in book 3, and it has to do with something that he experienced when he was young.
Okay. Well, this might be a tough one. When you were writing the first time around, and maybe it was more recreational, we'll say.
Right.
And now you're looking at it as a job, and there's deadlines and more discipline to get things done when they have to be done.
Right.
Is it still as much fun for you now?
It is when I get into it.
Yeah.
Sometimes if I let myself stop and think about, oh my gosh, what people are waiting for this, and I have people now who Facebook me, how's book 3 coming? any news on book 3? When's it going to be out? And I guess that's a good thing, but at the same time, I feel like I don't want to disappoint people, And the other thing I will tell you that doing the second one, the writing itself was just a pleasure for me, and even book 3, even though it was sort of hard to pull it out of myself, it was still a challenge, and I really liked that feeling. And I was very happy when it all was on, finally I got it on the page, and I was like, oh, it was just such a good feeling. But the whole stress of trying to meet expectations of people it constantly weighs on me. But I didn't have that. That's the beauty of a first novel. You're like, I'm writing a book, and I'm going to put it on pages, and we'll see what people think. And if you have to follow a book that did pretty well the first time with the second one, there are always going to be people out there who don't like the second one as well as the first. There's nothing you can do about that. But your hope is that that the majority of people like it at least as well, and will recommend it and will continue to read your work as a writer. But it's a constant thing that sits on my shoulder now, the thought of whether it's going to be received well. And I don't think that there's any writer out there who doesn't have that feeling. At least that's what from the writers I've met over the last couple of years, it's a very common thing.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you have, I think you said, idea sheet where you lay out some of the concepts. Mm-hmm. Do you do a lot of outlining before you write, or do you just sort of jump into it?
I guess I would say that I do a lot more thinking before I outline. I do outline some. Before I feel comfortable writing, I have to know how the story is going to start, how it's going to end, and a few events that are going to take place in between, so that I have sort of a mental roadmap. Otherwise, it's just like aimless wandering, and then I start to feel nervous that, this story is not going to take shape. But once I have those basic points, then I actually do an outline. And I may not outline the whole book, but I outline at least a good chunk of it at a time, so I can follow along with. It provides a more detailed map for myself as I'm writing. And especially with the way they're written, the timeline in the past and the present, I want to have things click at just the right times, and I want to have the chapters cause a reader to want to continue to reading, to go from the first to the next one. So it's important to have that sort of laid out. Actually, what I do is I take a piece of paper, I divide it in two, and I'll put the past on one and the present on one, and the past on one and the present on one, so that I can see going across what's going to happen in each chapter.
Okay. And about how many hours a day do you say you work on your book now?
I would say a good, when I'm actively writing, probably 5 to 6 hours is probably what I have with juggling everything else. And, I take my son to and from school, and I kind of manage the house because my husband has a huge, long commute, and he's not really home too much except late in the evenings. But it changes. Right now I'm sort of, because I've handed in the manuscript to my editor, I have sort of a lull. So I'm out visiting and doing events like this, and visiting family, and catching up on sleep, and spending time with my son, and doing the things that I wish I could do all the time, but that any working parent wishes that he or she could do all the time. But when I'm actively working to meet a deadline, the weekend before I finish the book, I wanted to get it done and get it in, and I just worked literally like 12 hours a day for 3 days over the weekend, and just pushed to get it done.
And is there a general target date in mind for your third entry?
One? I think the tentative publication date is September 8th, 2015, about a year from now, not 11 months from now. But it's not locked in stone. When a publisher sets a date, they don't really put it in stone until the manuscript has been formally accepted for publication, and that happens after you work through it with your editor and make the changes that you want. And that hasn't happened yet. But I don't know why it didn't work with that date.
And then where do you see yourself going from there? You staying at Mill River?
I would like to stay in Mill River. I'm starting to get inklings for the plot of a fourth book. And I think that is sort of up in the air right now because a lot depends on how the second book and the third book do. My editor is very reassuring. She says, Darci, we're going to build a career for you. We're totally behind. And I will say that the support that I've gotten from her and my publicist and the marketing person and everybody there, the cover artist, has been phenomenal. I couldn't ask for a better experience. But it is a business. When you get down to the nitty-gritty, they do need to turn a profit from the books that they publish. And so as much as she may love the books and as much as everyone on my sort of publishing team may be behind them, a lot depends on how they're received. And so, but I would like to write another Mill River book, whether it comes out with my publisher or whether I go out on my own or whether it goes to someone else. It'll have to be a new contract. And that's for the future. My agent says, don't worry about that now. It's too early to know anything or to negotiate anything. So I'm just preparing as best I can with a new idea, and I hope I get to act on it.
Okay, great. And one other thing I wanted to ask you, sort of going back to when you were more or less on your own, with some support, it sounds like, versus now. You had complete creative freedom then, with your cover image and everything.
Right.
Do you have as much freedom now to do?
Well, with some things. My publisher liked the self-published image that I used so much that they basically you took it and souped it up a little bit for the cover of the print version of Recluse. With Redemption, usually what happens is, from what I've been able to learn, if you're an author with a house and they're designing your cover, for instance, the art department will do 3 or 4 different possibilities, and then they present them to you and they say, "What do you think?" Or they narrow it down and your editor says, "Well, this is the one I think we should use." And if you have any comments, they may or may not take those into consideration. And with the cover of Redemption, my editor asked me, she's like, "What do you envision for it?" And that's very odd, for them to solicit your opinion beforehand. And I said, I just see 2 houses with a tree and a tire swing, just like if I were to pull an image from the book. And so she took that back to the art people, and they worked on it, and they showed me an initial version of this, which is very close to this. The houses were actually in the opposite position, and I said, I love it, except the houses should be switched. And they switched the houses for me. And I said, I think the font's too skinny. They changed the font. And I said, I couldn't ask for anything else. So I did have a lot of input. It's not complete control, but I did feel like I was included in the process very much, and I appreciate that because it's not common. In terms of the structure of the book, before I started writing Redemption, I had to submit sort of a short synopsis of what I proposed the story would be about, and that has to be, approved. And my editor was like, "Oh, fine, go for it." So there was no issue with what I wanted to do. There was no issue with what I wanted to write about for book 3. She had no problem. So, there is, as I say, I think that they really have made me feel like I'm part of a team.
Good.
I appreciate that.
Well, Redemption's been out there now for a little while. What have you heard so far?
Mostly that the early reviews are very strong, and I think that the early reviews are stronger for Redemption at this stage than they were for Recluse, which actually gives me hope.
Yeah.
I have heard from some people that they didn't like one particular character, and I knew that would be a reaction. But one of my goals as a writer for this second book was to create characters who are more real and more deep and fleshed out than my first. I think character development is something that you improve with as you complete each book. And the honest truth is that in your life, you're not going to like every person that you meet. People have problems that you may have to deal with, and I wanted that to be reflected in the story. So, but overall, it's been good. I really, I'm getting letters now from people again, which hasn't happened, since Recluse was sort of exploding, but those letters have been very positive.
Okay. Well, what advice would you have for somebody out there who wants to be a writer?
Have a thick skin. Make sure that you can take care of yourself in some other way until you get established. When you're actually coming up with a story, and these days a lot of people choose to self-publish, and unlike when I did it just on a whim, now self-publishing in the 3 years since I did it has sort of evolved into an alternative way to build and maintain a writing career. It's totally accepted now. So I actually think that's a good thing because people, it gives more writers a chance to get out there, get their work read. It gives more options for readers, especially those who like to read ebooks and Kindle addicts. But I would say whether you go traditional, when you're going to try the traditional route, or you decide to self-publish, come up with a story that moves you emotionally. When you think about your favorite books, or at least the books that you remember reading, at least for me, they're the ones that made me laugh, or scared me, or made me cry. And those are the kind of books that I not only remember, but I go to other people and I say, you have to read this because, it's amazing, or it did this, or you just won't believe this. So really put your heart into your story. I think that you have to believe in the story that you come up with, and you really have to work to put your own emotions into the characters and into the events that happen, because that's how you're going to get those things translated to your readers. It's how you're going to move people. And the whole thing about publishing now, whether it's self-publishing or traditional publishing, is finding a way to stand out from the masses. You've got to have a book that people like, and you've got to get it noticed. And the best way to get a book moving, if you're a writer, is through word of mouth. That's what happened to the first book for me. I couldn't have found any success with it if people hadn't read it, liked the story, and recommended it to other people. And that's so important. And people are not going to recommend it if the book doesn't connect with them and move them in some way.
And I know we talked about some of your own hurdles that you had to overcome. What are some of the biggest pitfalls that aspiring authors might expect to encounter, and some ways to keep going?
You have to realize that when you finish your book, it is in no way ready to launch out to the world at that point. But a lot of people, especially people who self-publish, think that it is. And they don't want to hear that, not only do you have a bazillion punctuation errors and material that you really can't tell at that point. I mean, when I get done writing, I didn't look at my third book, I didn't look at it for a month after I sent it to my agent. I just put it in a drawer and did other things, mostly publicity things for the second book, because I just finished it, and I wanted to be able to go back and read through it for the first time with somewhat of a distance between it. But I encourage people who are writing to get opinions from trusted people. Find a half dozen or a dozen people who are willing to read your book and tell you what they honestly think. And that's tough for some people to hear, but it's so important. Take that feedback to heart. Go back and be brutal. I mean, Stephen King always says you have to kill your darlings when you're editing. You may love a character, you may love a scene, you may love something that someone says, but if it doesn't fit, and if it doesn't make sense, and if the book is better without it, you have got to hit the delete button. And that's tough. I have a whole file of things that I really like, and I just couldn't bear to completely delete, so they're saved in a little folder. And maybe someday, there'll be a time when little scenes or little dialogue that I could pull back into something, but that didn't work in a particular book or a particular place.
And were you always a big reader as well as a writer?
Always, always. I mean, I love to read. I don't have as much time to read now as I should or as I would like. But one of the things that that I get to do when I hand in a book and I'm sort of waiting for my editor to come back to me is go through a pile of things that I've been wanting to read. So I know I love The Snow Child by Ewan Ivey. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist last year or the year before. And I'm working through The Museum of Extraordinary Things by Alice Hoffman right now. And I have a number of other things to read, The Book Thief, and I want to get through all of the Hunger Games books because I've never read them. And I think it's important too, if you want to write, to read a lot, because I learn something from every book that I read. I mean, not every book, I don't like every book that I read, and I read books that are outside my sort of preferred writing style or writing story. I mean, I read stuff by Neil Gaiman, who is sort of spooky, but he is a master with words and imagery, and I think it's so important to read things that even if you wouldn't write them yourself, because you learn. Every author does something well. Something. It may not mean that the book works, it may not mean that you like the story, but you can learn something from every book that you read.
Okay. Well, I think I've about run myself out of questions, but you want to, are we out of time?